How quickly is the Coachella Valley expected to recover from the pandemic? A new economic forecast says the timeline is promising, and there are also some interesting trends. I spoke today with the director of UC Riverside Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, Dr. Christopher Thornberg. Dr. Thornberg, in your forecast for the Coachella Valley, you predict a fast economic recovery. Tell us about that.
Well, we have to keep something in mind. There's a couple things at play here when it comes to that prediction. The first thing is, as tragic as COVID has been over the course of the last year, we have to appreciate the millions of people who have lost their lives and the families, of course, that are continuing to suffer. But as tragic as this natural disaster is, natural disasters do not have long-run economic consequences. In other words, even if the government hadn't done anything, this would have been a relatively short recession. That's the nature of these kind of business cycles, completely different than what happened during the Great Recession. Now, of course, the government didn't acknowledge that. Quite the opposite. The government bought into these preposterously negative sort of forecasts that we saw, that this was the next Great Depression, it was a 10-year labor cycle hit, and so on and so forth, and then went and did one of the most insane amount of stimulus that we've ever seen. I mean, it's really over the top to a point that I can't even begin to talk about. $5 trillion plus in fiscal stimulus, $3 trillion in quantitative easing. And as a result of that, they have cooked this economy, parts of this economy, into a white hot mode right now. Anybody trying to buy a car right now knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, the combination of those things, it wasn't going to be a bad recession in the first place. They've loaded it full of stimulus anyway. And what this means is incredibly rapid recovery, but it's going to be an interesting ride as we get into that next expansion.
You also put in your forecast that some of the trends, for example, remote working and moving things online, retail, for example, are going to accelerate. Do you think that's going to continue after the pandemic ends?
Well, I would argue this way. While it's not going to be to the degree we saw it during the pandemic, clearly it's not going back to pre-pandemic. Look, the United States, California, Coachella Valley, we have way too much suburban retail space. That's been going on for a while. That's a known problem. Now you have a whole bunch of people who've learned just how convenient it is to get your toilet paper online. They're not going to go back to the store, as much as they used to. The net result of that, particularly in California, it's time to figure out this land use problem, time to deal with that. It's accelerating trends that are already in place. As for office, another really interesting situation. Predictions, surveys suggest about 30% of office working days will be work from home. Prior to the pandemic, it was about 10%. Again, a big cultural shift in the United States, but it doesn't mean the end of downtowns. It doesn't mean the end of office space. Most people don't want to work at home all the time. A couple days a week, max, is what most people say, according to surveys. The net result of that, of course, is that you see a shrinkage in demand for office space, but probably more consolidation in downtown type regions, all the more important for regions, including the Coachella Valley, to continue to invest in the infrastructure to support these kind of dense job zones that exist within most metropolises.
What about the eastern part of the Coachella Valley, which is more rural?
Well, again, I think the trends across the Coachella Valley are going to be relatively similar. There's no doubt the eastern part, as you know, a little bit more rural. Obviously, that's where a lot of the service workers that work in the west part of the valley live on a day-to-day basis. Those folks, of course, have had a tough year. We know how bad the tourism industry has been hit. Yes, the drive-in tourism coming from the coast has been still pretty good in Coachella, but you're not getting your snowbirds coming in from Canada, which you typically do, which is such an enormous part of the local economy. Good news is it's not just us that's going to see this big bounce back. Most of the globe will be. And of course, those folks in the eastern part of the Coachella Valley who are relying on those tourists will quickly find themselves back to work over the course of the next year.
One of the big concerns I keep hearing from business owners is hiring employees. Right now, a lot of their employees are staying home because they're collecting unemployment. So do you think that's going to continue? And once people do get back into the workforce, is it just going to be a flood of workers competing for jobs?
Look, prior to this, one of my big conversations has been about labor shortage problems. And by the way, it's not just California, although it's far more acute here. The entire nation is dealing with labor force problems. There's been a big slowdown in population growth. Millennials, as big of a generation as they are, is only a little bit bigger than boomers, who are now in the midst of retiring. What that means is there's been an incredible slowdown in the population growth for working age people. That means we entered this pandemic with a labor shortage, and almost assuredly, because some of the people who dropped out will be permanent, we're going to come out of it with even a tighter labor shortage. Now, California, we have an advantage. Look, California is one of the best places on the planet to live. People will come here if we give them the opportunity. Now, the problem in California is we don't. Why not? We don't build enough housing. Housing is the key to dealing with those labor force issues.